everyone, in this video I'll be teaching you the King's Gambit Declined. And the King's Gambit Declined opens with e4, e5. And now, similar to the Queen's Gambit, where we have c4, we have f4, sacrificing this flank pawn for a good central control and maybe a kingside castling. Now we have f6. This is the first variation. We're going to cover the lines with f6 and d6 and knight to c6. So from here, we see the move bishop to c4, knight to c6 developing, and knight to f3, adding more pressure to the centre. Bishop to c5. Now black is stopping white from castling, so this square is the bishop's dominating all these dark squares, so now white can't castle yet. So there could be some ideas of shifting the knight after you've played d3, like by defending this pawn with the bishop. You could like shift your knight over to this d2 square, then over to b3, then go after the bishop this way. So we have d3. So there could be some ideas of shifting the knight over to d2, then to b3, then the bishop would have to move. So knight g to e7, knight b to d2, e takes on f4, and knight to b3, so now going after the bishop. The bishop defends this pawn, so now white is able to castle. So castle's on the king side, and knight to e5, improving the position of the knight whilst attacking this light square bishop. Knight takes on e5, f takes on e5, and queen to h5 with check. g6 blocking this and shifting the queen to g4. Rook to f8, bringing the rook onto the f file, and we have d4. Knight to c6, adding another attacker to the d4 square, and we have d5, now closing in the position, so the knight has to move. And the knight shifts over to e7. So in this position you can see that white is more developed. The position is closed, so you can see this pawn closed in the position here. This pawn is closing in the position, so is the bishop helping with this. The knight controls the dark squares, and the bishop links up with this pawn, with the rook, and with the queen. So this is good for white, but black's position is a bit cramped. Doesn't seem like this dark square bishop will be developed. It's a bit trapped. Maybe you can castle on the queen side, develop the queen somehow, maybe to a good square once you've shifted the knight over to a better position. But that's going to be hard because this pawn controls a lot of squares for the knight. So you can see the squares that the knight would move to, this square is covered by the pawn, and so is this square, and you can't take. The bishop's in this square, and this is sort of it's quite a passive square to move to. You don't really want to move to this square. So this is better for white in this position. Let's move on to the next variation. e4, e5, and f4, which makes it the King's Gambit. f6. We're going to be covering one more variation with f6. So the variation we just covered was with the bishop to c4. Now we're going to be doing the knight to f3 variation. Knight to c6 and d3. So in this position you're connecting a pawn chain whilst defending the pawn on f4 with your bishop. Same thing as you would like to do in the Queen's Gambit. So the pawn that is on the c4 square in the Queen's Gambit, you defend it with the bishop on f1. So this bishop defends along this diagonal. This is what you do. You play d3 in the King's Gambit, but in the Queen's Gambit you play e3. Now we have a d5, trying to gain central control as black. E takes on d5, and we have queen takes on d5, bringing the queen into the centre. Instead of kicking away the queen with the typical move of knight to c3, and then the queen would have to move, instead we play bishop to e2, ready to castle first. Bishop to b4 with check. Bishop to d2, asking, do you want to take the bishop, do you want to have a trade? Or do you want to shift back along your diagonal? The bishop says, okay, I will go for a trade with bishop takes on d2. Knight b takes on d2. And we have e takes on f4. Castles. So the rook actually indirectly attacks this pawn. So if you shift the knight over, there could be some discoveries against the queen, maybe. Not really any good discoveries. And then you could probably, if you double attack this pawn, you could regain material. Knight g to e7. And rook to e1. So the rook moves to the e file now. Bishop to g4. So double attacking this knight with the queen and the bishop. And now we have c3. So there could be an entrance from the queen. The queen could shift over to b3, ask for a queen trade maybe. You could develop the queen somehow you can develop white's queen. And from here we have castles. So this queenside castling move is very effective because you double up. So the queen and the rook are both on the d file. Queen to b3. Now asking for a trade of queens. King to b8. So black only shifts the king into a better position, a safer position. Queen takes on d5. White wants to trade. Rook takes on d5 and rook a to c1. Rook h to d8, and now black has doubled up on this file, and this looks quite good for black. So both pairs have the two knights, and they both have the same coloured bishop. So this is a good position from both sides. When black looks a bit more active because the pawns have been pushed a bit further, and it looks like a better position. It looks more controlled. When white is a bit more defensive in this position because the bishop is attacking this knight in the position, and then this knight's defending it. This knight can shift over maybe. Knight could shift over to these squares. This is still good for white though, but probably a bit better for black. Let's move on. We've moved on from the f6 variation. Now we go to the variation with d6. So this d6 move, just defending the pawn. Now we have knight to f3, knight to c6, and d3. Knight to f6, and bishop to e3. Now black has noticed what white has just played, and the pawn goes for e takes on f4. So black has noticed that the bishop will lose tempo, so the bishop has to recapture on this pawn, because the bishop moved to e3, and now the bishop is going to recapture on f4 with bishop takes on f4, and now we have h6. Knight to c3, and bishop to g4. Bishop to e2, and we have bishop to e7. Castles and castles, both on the king side. King to h1, shifting over the position of the king, going to a safer square, and now we have a6. There could be an idea of a queenside expansion here, so pushing forwards. And now we have d4. So now this is very controlled for white. So the centre is very strong. So you can see the dark squares and light squares are controlled in this position. So the two knights are controlling light squares and dark squares. There's a dark square bishop on f4, which controls some dark squares, and two central pawns which control most of the centre. The bishop shifts back to h5. Bishop to e3. And now we have bishop takes on f3. Bishop takes on f3. And rook to b8. a4, stopping any ideas of pushing forwards now because the rook moved onto the b file, so there could be some ideas of black pushing forwards with b5. But instead, you can see in this position, white stops this, so the knight controls the square, and so does this pawn, so double attacking the square. So if this pawn pushes forwards, then we might see the pawn takes, then pawn takes, and then knight takes. So this is very good for white. Now from here is the final variation. So we've moved on from the d6 move, and now we're moving on to knight c6. e4, e5, f4, and knight to c6. Knight to f3 and d6. d3 and knight to f6. Bishop to e2 and b6. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop onto b7. And now we have castles on the king side, so defending the knight, and the rook has sort of a semi-open file in this position. Bishop to b7 and knight to c3. Bishop to e7 and we have a3. Castles and bishop to e3. Knight to g4. Bishop to d2 and e takes on f4. Bishop takes on f4 and knight g to e5. d4 attacking the knight, and knight takes on f3 with check. Bishop takes on f3, and now we have bishop to f6. So you can see white's bishops are they're quite active along this diagonal. So they're aiming across the queen side, and we have e5. Bishop to g5, asking for a trade of the dark square bishops. Bishop takes on g5, queen takes on g5, and e takes on d6. C takes on d6, and now developing the queen to d3. So there's not been any queen trade. This bishop is very strong. So you can see this bishop is holding the diagonal. So going across here, the two rooks are connected for both. So for white and for black. And these rooks are connected. The queen has been developed, and so is white's queen. They both have the light square bishops, so this looks quite nice. Maybe there could be some ideas of pushing the pawns forwards. Both king sides are very strong, but this rook has a semi-open file. So this is good for both sides, so probably a bit stronger for white. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video on the King's Gambit Declined. Please remember to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you soon.